So the famine signals that we measure are neuropeptide Y, NPY. You can measure things like ghrelin and AGRP. But we just get a sense of how good is this balance in the background, because that will predict how successful a person would be if you start to do a tapering process. And in addition to looking at those signals, we're actually looking at nutrient levels. Like, how are you in the proper caloric intake level? Are your numbers looking good that are proving that you're nourished? So those are all the things that we look at before considering tapering.
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. Great to see you two.
Hello.
Hello.
All right.
Hello.
On the show this week, we're going to be talking about GLP-1s. And we're going to answer the question that just about everyone is asking. If I start taking GLP-1s, do I have to take them for the rest of my life? It's a big concern, I think, for people. And I think people ask that question when they start taking medicine for blood pressure, medicine for cholesterol. Is this something I have to do forever? And the answer is kind of complicated, isn't it, Dr. Cooper? I guess it depends, right?
Right. It's really complicated. And I'm just so glad that I've got decades of experience with the GLP-1, so I have a better sense of what to expect over the long haul.
Yeah. And so take us back. What was like the first breakthrough GLP-1 that came on the market?
The first one was exenatide under the name Byetta, and that was in 2005. And that one was an injection, but you had to take it twice a day before you ate. And so it was a little bit difficult. And because it was short acting, it wasn't that effective, but shortly that was replaced with a longer acting form of that medication called Bydureon. And that was really effective. And even if we had that one here today, for certain patients, it worked really, really, really well and was very well tolerated. It had a little bit of quirkiness because it would leave these little lumps that were water that had to dissolve with the medicine over a few weeks in your tummy. So it was a once a week. It was the first once a week one. But it was so effective. And so I was really saddened that once it went off patent, there were no generic manufacturers for it. I really think if there's a generic manufacturer out there today and they bring it back, it will be very useful. So I'm petitioning for that.
Yeah. Andrea, what was the first GLP-1 that you started on?
I started with Victoza, I think.
Yeah, I think I did too. Yeah.
Sim something.
Simlin.
I did take Bydureon, but it didn't. I had a problem with that.
A reaction
and then it made some kind of lumpy things that I had some.
Yeah.
I think I'm in the book for that because it made some weird.
Well, we had to report it to.
I got reported. I got reported.
Which is not surprising.
No.
Andrea
and then
got reported.
I got reported. But I've taken pretty much everything else. I've taken Victoza, Simlin, Trulicity, Ozempic, and now I'm on Mounjaro. Wait, was there another one?
Well, there were different names for them because remember,
Byetta.
You did take Byetta first.
I took Byetta.
Uh-huh.
I loved them all.
Dr. Cooper, as these GLP-1 drugs have evolved, how have they changed in terms of their efficiency, their effectiveness?
Well, they've changed in several ways. One is really just the frequency of dosing is one of the first changes. That
2 times a day.
Yeah.
Once a day.
Right. And
then once a week.
And, one of the things is that the original GLP-1, the Byetta, I think that we would have had an earlier introduction of the GLP-1s if the scientists weren't working so hard to try to figure out how to make it so it was not an injection, because they really thought that patients would kind of push back against an injectable medication. But they went ahead and finally produced the injection. And so then the next step was, well, patients don't really want to take a medication twice a day. Can we get it to once a day? So that's when we went from Byetta to Victoza. And Victoza is liraglutide, which is also marketed later on. It was marketed as Saxenda for weight. So initially these all came out as diabetes medication. And so then after the once a day Victoza, then the drug companies were saying, well, we would do a lot better if we could get a once a week. We'd have better compliance. Patients would be more willing to take it than having to do a daily injection. So that's when we got to the once a week, which the first once a week was Bydureon. Bydureon is the long-acting form of Byetta, exenatide. And so that was the first one. And that one, the pen was really funny because it looked like a machine gun. It
was really weird.
Yeah, they kept trying to.
And it had like pellets in it or something.
Imagine taking that through TSA at the airport.
Yeah, it had pellets.
No, it wasn't.
No,
it was
what
just.
was it?
It just was really awkward.
Weird.
It was very hard to manipulate. Yeah.
I didn't like it.
And then they finally made that into a better pen, but yeah, and so then
And the pens themselves have changed too.
The pens have
technology of the pens.
Yep. I'd say Novo Nordisk definitely improved the pen. After the Bydureon pen, then Novo Nordisk came out with the Ozempic, which was the first once a week. Well, it wasn't the first because Bydureon was the first once a week, but the Ozempic was a better pen, basically.
And people have called Ozempic a game changer, though, Dr. Cooper. Do you agree with that assessment? Is Ozempic a game changer, or is it just a game changer economically for Novo Nordisk, the Danish?
That's a good question. When Ozempic came out, the studies had shown that it was more effective than Bydureon and Victoza at both lowering glucose levels and HbA1c levels for diabetes and also body weight excess in obesity. Although they weren't yet marketed as obesity medications, the science showed that, basically. But it came out, and so we were the first to jump on it, I think. We were waiting and waiting for the Ozempic to come out for our patients, and the minute it came out, we already had lots of patients on it. So at first, it did seem like if you stepped people up to the Ozempic from the other GLP-1s, that they had kind of more effective responses. But, after looking at this for decades, it really isn't necessarily that one medicine is always more effective than another. It's really each patient is different. So believe it or not, I still have patients today that are wishing they could get Bydureon because they've been on Ozempic and even Mounjaro, or Zepbound, and they still want the Bydureon back because their results were better and they felt better on it. And we can't get that medicine anymore. And that one was thought to be a lot less effective than Ozempic. So I think it's very individual. We definitely have some patients that take what's supposed to be the most effective med and it acts like water to them. I mean, it literally does not work. And then they'll take a med that's known to be or thought to be less effective and they have great response. So I think there's definitely, like all medications, there's an individual component to it. But at the time that Ozempic came out, it was, I don't think it was a game changer because it was still a GLP-1. It was a weekly, but there was already a weekly. The only difference was it was more effective in terms of lowering A1C levels and glucose as well as the weight for the majority of people, more effective. But and we have data that tracks back, which is really interesting because I've got data that does track back at least 16 years where we've been tracking this stuff. And we were able to see the percent of patients who respond to various treatments. So I was always expecting with these introductions of new medications that we're going to see like a big change in terms of percent of people responding, the amount they're responding in our overall thousands of patients that are long-term patients. And you don't see as much as you would think, which is really interesting. So I think that's why I don't want people to undervalue some of the older medications that are out there and think that they're not worth taking, because sometimes you can get them at a lower price, or get the coverage more. So, but in any case, the Ozempic did help because it was definitely more effective for the majority of people.
I think a lot of the game changer was that a lot of money was put into Ozempic in terms of advertising, and you saw it everywhere. And I mean, please, that damn song, you could hear it. I mean, oh, 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 Ozempic. And I mean, you hear it everywhere. And that was definitely a game changer I mean, really, in terms of advertising and in terms of, you heard about it everywhere. And I think you started to hear about people taking it. And then you sort of heard the backlash about people taking it, and you started hearing what it was doing. And I think also in terms of the time period, you started hearing about it more. You started hearing about it in the culture more. And that wasn't just an Ozempic thing. That was sort of, the tipping point sort of thing in our culture when something has been around for a while and then it becomes, oh, I've heard of that. I've heard of people doing that. I've heard of people doing that. So I think that's part of it too. But it's that damn song.
Well, and Ozempic, when it first came out, the dose also was up to 1 milligram. And so at that dose, it was more effective than the Bydureon and the Victoza, but not by a huge amount.
What does it go to now?
Well, now Ozempic goes to 2 milligrams
Oh, yeah.
for diabetes. But then as it's marketed as a weight-related treatment, it goes to 2.4 milligrams under the name Wegovy. So the dose increases. The higher doses are showing, more effect. And so, but at the time it came out, it also was competing at the time with Trulicity. Trulicity came out shortly after that. And Trulicity had a much higher market share than Ozempic did for many, many years. Trulicity was the number one prescribed. It has a very low side effect profile. And but since then Ozempic came out with a higher dose, and then Trulicity came out with a higher dose. So these keep coming out with higher doses. And then, of course, the semaglutide, which is Ozempic and Wegovy, came out as a pill. That was actually what you'd call a breakthrough, because it was the first pill. So when that came out as a pill form, that was the first time that a pill was able to be developed that would be a GLP-1 mimetic or agonist, act like a GLP-1. And so that is a peptide pill, the Rybelsus, and it's semaglutide, same as Ozempic and Wegovy. But the problem with that pill, it didn't really take off as much because it's not quite as effective as the Wegovy or the Ozempic, because as the injectable, basically. It's not as effective as the injectable. But also, it's a little awkward to take it because it has to be taken on an empty stomach, and you can only have a certain amount of water. You can't take your medications or eat for a half hour after. So it's got a little bit of a stumbling block there for compliance with patients. And so that held it back a little, and it didn't really take off as much as expected, I feel. But we received recent news that Lilly has a pill that will be coming out in the next couple of years, most likely. And it's a little bit different because instead of a peptide, it's what's called a small molecule. And it's still a GLP-1 mimetic. It still activates the same things that GLP-1 does. But because it's a small molecule, it's less expensive to produce. It doesn't require that finicky way of taking it. So that one might end up being a little bit more accepted in society. But people I found really don't care if they're doing an injection. I mean, they're fine with doing an injection.
And
So,
these new shot things are so easy to do. You don't even feel them. They're so easy.
Yeah, the needle is a micro needle. It's just
Yeah.
tiny,
I
tiny.
mean, when I first got that shot, I was like, did it even work? I don't even know.
right.
Dr. Cooper, this might be a dumb question, but how do GLP-1s result in weight loss? Like, what does it do in the body that causes you to lose weight?
Well, our own hormone, GLP-1, is from our gut. It's an incretin, it's called incretin. And it signals the brain that we have enough food supply. And so it's what we call a nutritional security signal. So it makes your body feel more secure about the nutritional status and nutritional environment. And so that signal feeding to the brain enables the brain neurochemistry to alter so that it's not broadcasting that you're in a famine. And by doing that, by toning down the famine signals and activating the brain security signals, then it really enables the metabolic rate, the energy expenditure, to kind of be flowing without hindrance, I should say. And then also it also signals the pancreas to output more insulin if your glucose is elevated. So that's what's called a glucose dependent insulin increase. So some people are worried if they don't have diabetes, they think, oh my gosh, this is going to increase my insulin and cause low blood sugar reactions or something. But it doesn't do that unless your glucose is elevated. So if you have an elevated glucose, it really stimulates the growth of new beta cells in the pancreas that manufacture insulin. So for type 2 diabetes, it's wonderful because it can actually restore insulin production in people who have kind of burned out their beta cells. So it's pretty amazing what it does. But I see the metabolism as there's these levers that you can pull. You know, on one side, there are famine signals. And what our goal with those is to keep them low, keep them from inhibiting the metabolic pathway. Because if you have famine signals, it's telling your body, conserve energy, don't burn body fat, keep your glucose up because we need the fuel. So we want to reduce the impact of the famine signals. And on the other hand, there's security signals, which are very reassuring that say, we have enough food, we weigh enough, so green light, burn fuel, don't conserve unnecessary amounts of energy, you can burn that fuel. So
instead of storing the fuel,
right,
which is where I was when I first came to see you, the body says, hey, let's burn that. And it doesn't go to my belly as fat.
Or my butt.
But does the brain also give sort of the green light to burning fat stores as well when it feels so secure?
Yeah. Well, also the security signals inform the brain that the body weighs what it actually weighs. That's part of the security signals. So where the famine signals can interfere with that, and also if your security signals are weak, they're not telling the brain that your weight is elevated. And so
Right.
your brain doesn't want your weight to be unnecessarily elevated. So it's all about how it perceives through these two kind of buckets of signals that are there. And so the point of the treatment, whether it's for diabetes or obesity or diabesity, all of that, other metabolic hindrances, the point of it is to restore the security signals to a strong level and to dampen down unnecessarily elevated famine signals so that we're creating a more realistic, accurate perception of what the body's actually doing. So that's the key. And so these GLP-1 meds are just one tool that goes on the nutritional security side. And the other thing to think about is it's kind of also these two buckets can influence each other. So if you have your security signals stronger, saying like the GLP-1 saying we have enough food, and then for as far as body weight, leptin is one of the ones, the body fat hormone leptin helps reassure the brain that we have enough body weight. But those security signals, if they're powerful enough, they themselves can also dampen down the famine signals that are inappropriately elevated, because they send a signal that makes the brain willing to reduce the output of the famine signals. But if the famine signals are too high, that can interrupt the metabolic pathway in a way that could actually end up reducing the security signals. So you've got to really be careful with these two buckets. These buckets, that's why we're so fanatic about people not going on diets, because that's just a dead end. It's going to end up with something getting thrown off balance in that security famine signal pendulum that swings. So, but the drugs are helpful tools, but the nutrition foundation is super key to also, being necessary. But one of the other medications that came out more recently, I would classify that as a breakthrough also, because it is the tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro, Zepbound. That one targets two hormones, so not just GLP-1, but another gut hormone that's called GIP. And so when you combine the GIP and the GLP-1, it accentuates the security signals. And so that's why the tirzepatide, for the majority of people, reduces the HbA1c and the glucose in diabetic patients and the excess high body weight in people that are struggling with that. So a little bit more than the pure GLP-1s in the majority of people. But again, it's very individual.
Right. Like for me, when I first came to Dr. Cooper, I weighed over 350 pounds, yet my signals said that my body thought that I weighed about 98 pounds. So my body was holding on, like my body thought that I was in a famine and didn't want to release any of the fat that was on my tush and on my middle because it thought that I was starving. So no matter what I ate, even though I wasn't eating very much, it thought that I was starving, so it didn't want to release any fat and make me thinner and healthier. And I had fatty liver and whatever.
Oh.
So I started taking these GLP-1 drugs, and within, I think it was like in a month and a half, the fatty liver was gone. I started losing weight at a very slow rate. I mean, my weight loss has been slow, but what I think of as the miracle of science, I always say that I am a product of science, the weight hasn't come back, which for me in my process is the most amazing thing, because as we've talked about before, I've been on like 40 diets or somewhere around there in my life, and the weight's always come back, and it hasn't come back. I mean, it's like, I think we're at like about 180 something pounds at this point, and the weight hasn't come back.
Right.
So that's
And before it always came back.
Oh,
right?
always. Plus,
Yeah.
I'd lose 75 pounds, 100 pounds, and then it would come back, 100 pounds, 120 pounds. But this has not come back. I eat whatever I want or whatever, and the weight is still slowly coming on, slow. But it hasn't come back, and that is the miracle of science and the miracle of these drugs, and which gets us kind of
And the miracle of not dieting.
not dieting at all. Oh, I don't diet at all. I eat everything that
For the
I
first
want.
time in your life.
For the first time in my life. It's not even just eating everything I want for the first time in my life. It's not thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And that took about a year and a half of like blocking out the like, oh my God, I'm eating fried chicken, I'm eating ice cream. Like, I don't even worry about it, and I just don't even think about it. But that gets us to our next thing is, am I on these drugs for the rest of my life? Am I, what was that word again? The
Titrating.
Up?
Titrating up or down.
Am I going up? Am I going down? Am I, what the hell's happening?
Yeah, Dr. Cooper, I'd love to know. I mean, some people, I'm guessing, will have to be on these for life. Some people will probably get to be tapered down. Some
Right.
people may get to stop taking the GLP-1s
Right.
altogether?
I
Can you?
figure I'm in for life.
I would love to know, Dr. Cooper, like break down those scenarios
Yeah.
so that we know if, which category we're going to be in.
Yeah. Well, I think, when I think about it, and again, I'm so grateful for having these decades of experience because when I first started out, I didn't know what to think, I mean, I
Well,
knew it
and the
was help.
drugs were new.
Well, yeah, I thought this is going to help people. So I was thinking that most likely at some point in the future, you would see people that were going to need to stay on these meds, some people that could taper off, but it wasn't clear. But over the decades, it became much more clear. And so what, what's interesting is there are situations where it is possible to taper off of medication, but there's got to be very specific conditions for that. But there are several situations where it's not likely you would taper off. So one example of that would be if, say, remember, we're looking at different parameters. We're not just looking at weight. So we're looking at, in the lab work, evidence of health parameters. That has to do with your cardiovascular health. It has to do with your liver, basically your liver health, your blood sugar, your A1C, all of those things. And so we're looking at all of that, but then we're also looking at your body weight, and we're looking at where do we think that weight is really supposed to be. And this is an area where a lot of people have kind of just not a realistic idea of where their weight should be, but some people do have a really realistic idea. But how would we ever know what the quote normal weight would be? And so what we do a lot is we check body composition testing. And body composition testing is really helpful for looking at the lean weight. The lean weight number is your bone density. It's all of the bone weight, basically, and your muscles, tendons, ligaments, basically everything that's not body fat is measured as lean weight. And so all we really need to know is that lean weight and then your frame size. So we look at frame size, and there's different ways to measure frame size. One of the it's not super accurate measuring frame size these ways, but it gives you some insight to modify things a little bit to get closer to what a person's lean weight should be. So you look at maybe wrist circumference. There's others that look at shoulder breadth, hip breadth, to get an idea of your skeletal frame size, basically. So that we take that into consideration, and then we take into consideration your athletic level. So are you a person that's very athletic? Are you a person that's doing kind of just some moderate activity, or are you pretty sedentary? Then we put in a factor there, because the more athletic you are, the more lean mass you should have. And the larger your frame size, the more lean mass you should have. So as we put these in, we have a calculating software that helps us see what the minimum amount of lean mass you should have is. Then when we do the body composition, we see how much lean mass you do have. And based on that, we can project out where your quote normal weight range is. And so that enables us to have a range that we know would be where the lean mass is adequate and the body fat is not excessive. It's in a normal range, basically. So that gives us that weight range that we're looking at. So conditions to reduce the medication or taper medication would require that the body composition shows that you're in that range that we're saying is considered balanced, and that your blood work looks really good in terms of your glucose levels, your A1C, your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your triglycerides, all of those factors. And that your security signals that we talked about, like your leptin and all of the beneficial signals, are at a strong level, while all the famine signals are at a reduced level. So the famine signals that we measure are neuropeptide Y, NPY, You can measure things like ghrelin and AGRP. But we just get a sense of how good is this balance in the background, because that will predict how successful a person would be if you start to do a tapering process. And in addition to looking at those signals, we're actually looking at nutrient levels. Like, how are you in the proper caloric intake level? Are your numbers looking good that are proving that you're nourished? So those are all the things that we look at before considering tapering. But there are some situations where even if most everything is balanced, except you've got, diabetes that's still really strong, and you're on these drugs and your A1C is still in a pre-diabetes range or something like that, or diabetes range, you're not going to go off those drugs. There's just no way. Just because your weight is okay, that you will not. You will stay on those drugs, because sometimes, diabetes is not always reversible. Usually it's not reversible. So if you've got long-term diabetes and you've lost some of the pancreatic beta cell function, these drugs aren't powerful enough to restore it in every person to the point where you'd be able to reverse diabetes. And so you'd be on this medication long-term for the diabetes, even though all the other aspects are controlled. Another group would be a person who may have all good numbers, everything lines up, but we have genetic evidence that they have a specific, what's called monogenic obesity, which is a dysfunction, a mutation within the metabolic pathway that causes just an inability of one of the, quote, brain substations to actually operate normally without medication. So if we have that, and examples of that would be what's called an MC4 receptor mutation or a POMC mutation. There's different ones, leptin receptor mutation, things that are documented through a legitimate genetic testing medical test. Then we would tell that patient, you have to be on these meds lifelong. It doesn't mean you have to be on high doses lifelong. They can be tapered down a little potentially, but you have to be on something because your own body, it doesn't function in a normal metabolic way, and it can't, because it's basically an area that doesn't work in that pathway on its own. So that would be another group. And then the third group where you would not taper until things look better would be the person who is not nourished. Maybe their body composition's okay, maybe their glucose and their blood pressure and everything is okay, and their weight's balanced, but they're not nourished enough, so their security signals are not sending out a strong enough signal that says, we're nourished, and their leptin is not lining up with their weight. It's suppressed because their body thinks they're starving still, or their famine signals are high. And so if there's that imbalance, we're working a lot with the dietitian to try to get them fueled better. And, we may need to taper medication actually because it might be obstructing their appetite. So we taper it a little so they can eat more, but we can't go off medication unless the body's own mechanisms look strong enough to kind of like take the ball after it's passed to your body from the medication. So then the perfect situation for tapering is kind of, you can guess, it's when all these things line up and the person is doing a great job on their nutrition, they're nourished, they're fueling exercise well, all of the security signals are strong, the famine signals are weak, or they're not inappropriately elevated, their health parameters are great, their weight is balanced where it should be, and now it's like, and it's not just like, oh, I hit this weight, so let's start tapering. It's like, let's make sure everything's stable. And then it's very small incremental reductions. And in our patients, we don't rely on like just a GLP-1 for treatment. We usually use a cocktail approach because it's more effective. So we'll start with very small changes in these doses or a particular med, but it's very small. And then we do really close monitoring during a tapering phase. But tapering can take 2 years to taper. that way. But it can be very effective. And then we have, because again, we've been doing this for a couple decades, we do have a fair number of patients who have tapered all the way off of medication. So, and some that take a very tiny dose and not even on a weekly basis. So it's really very individual. And I'm not doing this to be prescriptive to anyone listening at all. I'm just telling from my experience with our patients over decades what we've noticed. And so I think that should help clarify it maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, Dr. Cooper. And I think what really sticks out in my mind from what you said is that if we just look at the scale and say, is my GLP-1 working? Oh, I can start tapering off. It's such a more complicated system because you're looking at all the security signals, all the brain signals, all the gut signals, the whole metabolic loop and how it's talking, plus insulin levels and blood sugar levels, and all that is so important in this whole thing. So the short answer is it depends.
Right.
Well, I have to take these drugs for
I
life.
think you have to look at every person is different. Every person's
Yep,
drugs
true.
are different,
Very
you know?
true. Yeah.
But I think that that's the way to think about it. I mean, not everyone is the same. Look at the three of us. We all look different. We all are different. Our bodies are different. That's the way it is. And also, it's not just about weight. I think that it's what I always say. These are not weight loss drugs. These are metabolic drugs. And we have to always remember that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm so excited about is, 40 years ago, we wouldn't even be having this discussion, but now we have all these tools at our discretion, and we're finding just the universal benefits of these GLP-1s.
It's amazing.
It's just like a miracle.
I think it's a miracle.
I do too. I do.
I
too.
really do.
Just
And we are the
reinforcing.
miracles of science.
just by reinforcing what the body makes naturally. That's really cool.
And we should
All
really
right.
keep in mind that, like, in our own body, it's not just GLP-1 that keeps our metabolism healthy. It's like just an array of different neurochemicals and hormones that keep our metabolism so healthy. So to think that we can just rely on the GLP-1, and not do other things to really improve our metabolic function, or, in the future, we're going to see more and more meds that are combining the different beneficial metabolic hormones into one medication. And so we'll see that over the next several years. That's been the dream of scientists probably for like 100 years, actually, to be able to have that. But especially since the first GLP-1 that came out, which was the Byetta, that's the company that also made the medication Symlin, which is synthetic amylin. But that company was called Amylin Pharmaceuticals. And the scientists there, they were the ones who kind of kept saying that what we need is this cocktail of favorable metabolic hormones and messengers that are kind of reproducing a healthy metabolic signal. And that the more we do as a cocktail of combining these, the more benefit patients will have. And they were right. And so now finally we've got other drug companies. Amylin Pharmaceuticals doesn't exist anymore, but we've got now Novo Nordisk and Lilly working on those combinations, as well as other drug companies that are jumping in to the mix.
Yeah, lots of options. Well, this has been super interesting. Thanks to both of you for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.